There is a place that is spoken about only in whispers, a dark area that spawns the beginnings of urban legends, a place where anything can happen and usually does. During the light of day, it hides just outside of view, but when the sun goes down, spirits, creatures of the night, roam free, and things do go bump in the night. It is in every state and every country, and there is no escaping it, no matter how safe you feel behind your locked doors and latched windows. So we invite you to turn down the lights and turn up your radio while we join Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis, your hosts, on a journey into the darkness on the edge of town.
Hello and welcome. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. Beyond the Darkness is on the air. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, Tim Dennis. Tonight, Tim, we're going to take a look at ghosts and paranormal investigating. And we want to do this. You want to go to somebody who has experience, knows what's going on, has been around long before the advent of all the paranormal TV shows, and find out about the history of this. And I really wanted to kind of find somebody we could discuss the differences in haunting styles, from ghosts to spirits to poltergeist activity to residual hauntings to intelligent hauntings. What do all of these things mean? And, you know, there's this huge glossary that's been built up over the last 10, 12 years since all the TV shows have kind of hit the marketplace. And I really wanted to get back to the roots of understanding the paranormal and research and find out really from one of the guys who's been out there doing this the longest and hardest, does he see any major changes? Has all the new technology in the world done anything to bring us any closer to real answers than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? So tonight, joining us on the show is Loyd Auerbach. He's well known as a leading expert on ghosts and psychic experience. He's got a master's degree in parapsychology. He's director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, a professor at Atlantic University and at JFK University, and creator and instructor of the certificate program in parapsychological studies at HCH Institute, available both in California and for distance learning. He's back. It's been many years since he's been here, but he's back this evening to share his wealth of knowledge with us. Ladies and gentlemen, the professor of the paranormal himself, Mr. Loyd Auerbach. Loyd, thank you for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I know that you've got an extensive resume here, and you're also, what is it, the president of the Forever...
It's Forever Family Foundation. It's a nonprofit organization that works with spirit mediums, certifies mediums through a fairly lengthy process, and supports the research of basically scientists in looking at evidence for life after death in a variety of forms, everything from mediumship to, of course, ghosts and hauntings to reincarnation, near-death experiences, all of that. So it's a nonprofit, and it's free to join, in fact, for people who are interested.
That fascinates me. So you're actually taking a look at people that make claims to be sensitive, psychic mediums, and certifying them and making sure that the people that are out there making these claims legitimately have some kind of talent. When you're doing that, what are some of the protocol? I know there's some of it you probably have to keep secret because you don't want to tip the hat on what you're looking for. But I mean, what kind of protocol really interests Loyd Auerbach to say, yeah, this guy's the real or this lady's the real deal?
Well, I actually didn't create the protocol. The protocol was created by the original, some of the founders of the foundation, which was a little over 11 years ago. But what they look for is what we call evidential mediumship, which means that the mediums are kind of provided with people they have to read blind. They don't know anything. They don't know the names of these people. They don't know who they are. These are actually sitters who have been somewhat trained to be non-responsive where they're supposed to be. And some of the readings are actually done on the phone. Some of them are done via Skype. We used to do some of them in person, but it's just gotten too difficult to set those things up since it was pretty much set up only on the East Coast. What's looked for are, I guess you could say, what Gary Schwartz years ago used to call, dazzle shots. People providing specifics to the sitters about certain loved ones that they have who have passed on. So the mediums know that obviously the sitter who's there has someone who they're thinking of, but then they have to come up with a description, they have to come up with personality descriptions, they have to come up with factual information, and there's a level of grade. We grade the statements, the sitters grade the statements, and it has to be graded at a certain level or above. before they get the certification. Plus, there's a questionnaire about their ethics, and they have to offer to volunteer. It's a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization. So mediums actually have to do something for us, too, not just get certified as well.
The idea that somebody has the sensitivity and ability to see, speak, and communicate with the dead. Now, you've been at this for a long time. You've met a lot of charlatans and a lot of extremely talented people in this field, and you're a mentalist. So you know how to read people. You know how to exploit a situation and give people what they think they're listening for and kind of cajole them. Is it, when you're watching these mediums do this, even ones that are really good at what they're doing, do you see a flaw to their method ever? Do you ever reach in and think, I could have gotten that same answer that same way, or I could have led them down that path?
Well, there's going to be some amount of information that is just simply from nonverbals and actually just from observation when you're in the room with them. So you got a medium and you have a large group of people, and the medium walks over to someone and says, I'm picking up on an older woman, and starts providing information for specifically. Now, there's going to be some feedback from that individual who's being read. There's no question about that. So we look for the evidential piece of it, so the real factual stuff, the things that they could not possibly have known. And unless you do research about the person, the sitter, in advance, there are certain things that just simply cannot be picked up on. And the context in which you're providing this, when a psychic does a reading of someone, even if they come up with factual information, they're not, saying, well, your grandmother acted like this, and they're not moving around as if that's the grandmother. They're not coming up with signature moves or statements or the way they say things. They're coming up with sometimes with factual information and descriptions, but not the personality stuff that seems to come through in the best evidential mediums. We actually had a panel of mentalists, some of the best readers in the world of mentalism a number of years ago, looking at video of a couple of mediums that Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona was doing research with, and in the better controlled situations, the majority of the guys on this panel said, I couldn't do that without having information up front. So, yeah, we could do that, but we'd have to have a lot of stuff about it. Need to know who the sitter is going to be up front.
Maybe explain for our listeners that aren't familiar with the term. I mean, we know there's a TV show called The Mentalist, but what exactly is a mentalist and what do they do?
Well, actually, the guy on the TV show, The Mentalist, wasn't a mentalist.
Okay.
It's really kind of amusing. A mentalist is an entertainer. Basically, mentalism is either on the side of or kind of a branch of stage magic, and we simulate mental abilities, psychic abilities. Not all mentalists use the term psychic when they're talking about it. Sometimes they'll make up some psychological mumbo-jumbo to describe what they're doing, but it's about thought reading. It's about predictions. It's about the things we consider psychic also, but we are simulating those things for entertainment, and hopefully we're being entertaining when we do it.
Now, with that said, when you're engaged in that kind of program, do you ever start picking up on things that you think, there's no way I should know this? There's no way. I mean, I'm doing a show right now. This is smoke and mirrors, but you start picking up on actual details and information for these people?
On occasion, I get flashes. I know a number of my colleagues do as well, who are psychic entertainers. This is actually something that I interviewed some people for years ago, and one of my colleagues, late colleagues, Marcello Truzzi, talked to magicians and mentalists. And it is something that happens to performers, not just mentalists, but also to magicians, where they'll pick up things or things will happen that just seem to be spontaneous cases of ESP in some way, shape, or form. And it's partly because we're pretending or in the mindset as we're putting out that we're being psychic. Some things do flash on us. Now, a magician who is performing an actual magic show, if they say what they're getting in their head, just that flash, if they're wrong, it reflects badly on them, because in a magic show, the magician's got to do everything. In a mentalism or psychic entertainment show, let's face it, ESP is not 100%, never is, probably never will be. So if you get it wrong, it's no big deal. You can always just say that it was ESP. I just got this popped into my head. And the thing is that more often than not, those flashes are right.
When you're scrutinizing these mediums and sensitives for evidentiary product from them, how right do they have to be? Are you looking for anything above 50 or 60% of dead-on information, or does it have to be a much higher level for you?
Well, there's a kind of a scoring factor that the executive director and the vice president, there's a couple by the name of Bob and Fran Ginsberg. They're actually the founders of the Forever Family Foundation. And there's a scoring procedure that's in place that looks at the specifics of what the person's come through. It kind of averages over 5 readings. So they have to do 5 readings. It's not just one reading. They have to read 5 people. And we have to get the feedback from all 5. So it's going to be an average. Usually it's going to be above 70% for that sort of thing. But we don't expect anybody to get really 100% every hit, because that's not human. That's not normal for that. And that's, of course, only one part of what the foundation actually does. We also have been looking very carefully and really interested in the research that's gone on in certain places that show that working with mediums can actually be good for the grieving person. There's clinical evidence that shows that working with a spirit medium actually can be positive, have positive benefit. That's, of course, there are phonies out there, and honestly, there are people. It doesn't matter how good the medium is. The person continually needs to talk to that deceased relative. There's something that's missing, and all of our mediums always advocate counseling. It's not, don't just come to me. You really need to seek counseling. If you're having a hard time dealing with grief, you have to do the normal psychological stuff.
Yeah, I've watched, and there have been many shows that I've been to where mediums are doing readings, and I see nothing special in what they do in the sense of hoodoo, voodoo, magic-y stuff, but what I have seen is some really remarkable turnarounds in people's personality. And I have a lot of people aren't you going to call them out as a fake or a charlatan? And I'm like, you know what? I've been on a counselor's couch, and I've been there for a long time, and I still deal with a lot of issues. But I've watched some of these mediums, whether I believe they're real or not, work with somebody, and that person feels healed after 1 hour-long session of just getting some closure. And to me, it's like, who's the fraud then? We're looking at that kind of situation.
Doctors give out placebos.
Right, exactly. And they sometimes give out placebos for actual illnesses, and the placebos actually work. Yeah. So, you're right. And to me, that's the important thing. And what I've always watched as a benchmark, if they're you know what, Loyd, I'm sensing there's some really dark things. You're going to have to come back to me again next week, and it'll be another 150. That's when my alarms start going off. But when I see somebody, Loyd, listen, your mom's here and she loves you so much. She's so proud of what you've done. And you see the person looking at the ground and digging at the ground with their toe. And as this message comes, their head rises, their shoulders go up, some tears come, smiles break out. And you can see them actually come out of the shell. To me, it's always been, in my opinion, no harm, no foul. If you're feeling better after this reading, you would have paid that money or more to go see a psychologist who may not have done for you what you just needed to hear. And that's what I always think is interesting about the idea of mediumship. It's people that just, what they really want is kind of reassurance. They just want somebody else to tell them what to do.
Yeah, they want somebody else, but that's why people see psychologists also and see counseling. And the whole grief thing, there's not a lot of really good literature or study on the process of grief. And that 5 stages of grief thing that people always cite, which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with, doesn't apply to everybody, and certainly doesn't apply in the order in which she wrote it, and she even said that. So it's hard to find a really good therapist who specializes in grief counseling. And if that one session will help you out significantly, just maybe it's talking to a friend of yours instead of talking to a medium, but something has to be, you have to give power as the grieving person. You have to give power over to someone else to reflect back what you actually need. And that's actually what many mediums do. And if they're reading psychically the person instead of talking to the dead, they're still having a direct impact on the person's grieving process.
And that's where I wanted to kind of go with this conversation, Loyd, is looking at what is it that we're communicating with. And let's go over some of the glossary and what you think the definitions of these things are. And are they the same and the words are interchangeable, or are there definite lines that are drawn between them? And we hear spirit and ghost bandied about pretty interchangeably. Do you believe that there is a definite difference between a ghost and spirit?
Well, the word ghost has a lot of baggage all over the world. But it typically refers to someone who has passed away, who's still communicating in some way, shape, or form. We tend to use in parapsychology the word apparition to represent that consciousness of someone who's passed away and is appearing in some way, shape, or form to someone's perceptions. Mediums like to use the word ghost when they're referring to somebody who hasn't crossed over. So somebody's dead and they're here, but they have not crossed over to whatever the other side happens to be. And they use the term spirit for people who are projecting back from that other world, as they say. But, you can use the word spirit, consciousness, soul, all those things are kind of interchangeable, and I think it really depends on the context of what we're talking about.
Yeah, there's all these other then breakdowns you've got of different types of hauntings.
Right.
And people associate ghosts or, disembodied spirits with a lot of these. But let's look at something like a residual haunting. Are true residual hauntings really something that seem to have no idea that we're there, or do they sometimes seem to engage us, but other times they're just going about their everyday life like you're watching it on a TV screen?
Well, if you're going to call it a residual haunting, it's about a recording.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, haunting refers to places. The word haunting is not exclusive to the paranormal. A haunt is a place that someone hangs out a lot. In fact,
Right.
Old detective movies used to talk about somebody, going to their old haunts to check out information about the suspect. So we talk about places and sometimes things. Residual, what you're implying there, or whether you're calling it residual haunting or a psychic imprint or imprinted haunting, it's about information imprinted in the environment. It's a residue that living people are picking up, so there's nothing to communicate with. As soon as you communicate with that entity or that figure that's there, that's not a haunting anymore. That's an apparition case.
Have there been cases that start with a residual where it seems to be a looped pattern, and as time progresses and the more you pay attention to it, it seems to become aware of you? I mean, do you understand where I'm going with that kind of question?
Yeah, I do. Well, I think that in those circumstances, what we may be dealing with, and we certainly have had these cases
Mm-hmm.
of an imprint, a residual recording of that same person who is there as a ghost. So some of it was recorded when they were alive, and other parts of it of what's happening is actually that individual's communicating. So it's like if I'm in a room and somebody is playing on the TV set a video of a TV show that I did, all right, I'm in the same room as that recording. These are two different things.
Right.
But they are in the same room. So if somebody's only watching the recording and finally notices that I'm standing there and starts to talk to me, well, then I'm here. You have to really take each individual piece that's represented and see what's actually going on. On the other hand, some people, let's face it, when we're alive, we sometimes have habits. I had an experience reported to me years ago by a TV talk show host here in the Bay Area, where he grew up in a haunted farmhouse in the Midwest, and they were kind of the pattern footsteps back and forth outside all the bedrooms upstairs, whether the lights were on or off. This happened at 11 o'clock at night. And one night when he was 16, he got out of the room. He decided to figure out where did the footsteps go, and he walked out of the room as the footsteps, he heard them go right past his room. There's no one he's seeing because the lights are on. And he starts walking after them, and the footsteps started going faster for the first time ever, and he pretty much chased them down the stairs, and he claimed that he heard the footsteps running into the living room, a scuffling sound, a thud, and then the sound of somebody getting himself up and brushing himself off and running towards the front door, as if the invisible man had tripped over a carpet and run to the front door, and they never heard it again. So this might have been a case of someone who had been in the house at one point, because it was a very old house, and was pacing back and forth. He probably did that when he was alive, and when Patrick actually decided to go check it out, this is the first time he had any interaction, and he pretty much chased the ghost out of his house.
See,
that's pretty rare.
Right. And that's an aspect of a lot of the hauntings that really light me up. I think the fact, and I don't know where you stand on this as well, but I wonder how many of these hauntings are taking place are not necessarily hauntings as we consider them. They're not the dead in the sense of, Grandpa died and now his soul is hanging out in our house.
Yeah.
Because one aspect of residual hauntings I've always found fascinating is how do they know to start up? What is the ignition key to start that haunting taking place?
Well, there's two things here. One is the recording itself, and the recording, the imprint, happened when the person was alive.
Right.
It didn't happen, so it's like, we have plenty of movies and TV shows with celebrities who are dead. Now, we can still watch them.
exactly.
So they were recorded. They were recorded when they were alive. The recording mechanism, there's a lot of modeling around that. We have some ideas about what it might be. It seems to be related to the geomagnetic field. It's the reason why we even started using EMF devices to begin with, to detect fields. And it seems that there's two things here. One is the time it was recorded, and that seems to be related to the event itself, whether it was incredibly repetitive, like people cooking in a kitchen seems to be a common sound of haunting that people pick up on, or it was a highly emotionally charged event like a murder or a rape or something like that. And then the conditions would have had to been correct in the area. The Earth's magnetic field would have had to pick that up. But that's part one, so it gets recorded. Part two is who turns on the VCR, the video.
Right.
So somebody goes into the building, and there's two things that seem to have to happen. One, the conditions have to be that maybe the Earth's field or some other field is ramped up a little bit. The Earth's magnetic field does shift quite a bit, even locally. And so think of it as giving power to the recorder or the playback. And then you, the witness, have to be psychically sensitive or open to it. Your brain has to be able to pick it up. So what turns it on is that there is a witness there. Otherwise, the tape is playing all the time. And it just may be playing in the background until the field is strong enough to pump up the volume a little bit for us to hear it or see it.
Or do you believe that we're always haunting ourselves? Could it be that, Loyd's got this specific thing that he does every night? He gets up, puts his teacup in the sink, goes upstairs, goes to the bathroom. You hear him walk down the hall. He goes into the bed creaks as he gets into it. And I hear that tonight, and no big deal. And I wake up in the morning, I go downstairs, and you're still sleeping on the couch. And I go, hey, Loyd, why would you get back up in the middle of the night? No, man, I fell asleep on the couch. But I could have sworn I heard you. I think a lot of times we're haunting ourselves. It's going on all the time. But until Loyd is no longer part of the picture, he's gone now. Now it suddenly becomes a haunting. Do you think that is what's going on around us a lot of times? It's just replays of ourselves?
Yeah, I think that does happen. It's a living. We have tons of cases going back over 100 years of these hauntings, these imprints, that when people witness them and they come to find out that the people they saw in the imprint, the people they saw in the haunting, those people are still alive. One of my earliest cases was involved that. The people left behind in something they were doing repetitively every night. When they moved out of the house, the next couple experienced it. And it was pretty easy to kind of track next. It was the previous owners, and they were in their late 20s. They were still alive. So people do leave impressions behind. We certainly leave emotions behind. Anybody who goes house hunting knows that you walk into a house and you get a vibe sometimes of the people who live there. And it's something that we can pick up. So here's the interesting thing. There have been reports, and I've had people report them to me, and there are reports in the literature, parapsychology, going back, of people coming home, seeing a figure at the end of the hall before they turn the lights on or as they're walking in, if it's daylight, and they very quickly recognize that person as themselves. So they have an experience of themselves as a ghost. And, of course, that freaks people out more than almost anything else because people don't think of the idea of recording, of it being a recording.
Right. And now, thanks to Hollywood, that automatically means that you've just seen your evil doppelganger. And,
of course.
Right. And it makes it a creepier experience. But you brought up an interesting point. You talk about the geomagnetic principles have to be right. I often wonder, when people say, listen, my house is haunted. Nobody's ever died here. I built this from a cornfield. But now all of a sudden it's active and you've got this going on. Or you say, I don't know if it's the haunting from across the street where the murder took place 100 years ago. If the world is changing, we know the polar points are changing and everything shifts. Could it be that the world is like a ball under a blanket? And as the ball continues to move and that blanket is kind of a static, it's its own geomagnetic principle, the haunting is where it always was, but the ball underneath it has moved to a different position. So now the haunting is still overlaid, but now it's on my neighbor's house instead of mine.
That's possible. It may also be that the field is strong, whatever is going on, your perception, the witness's perception, psychic perception, or the connection to the magnetic field is strong enough that you're picking it up from across the street and kind of superimposing over your own house. We don't have enough data at this point about the shifts, the geomagnetic shifts from point A to point B on the land itself. We do know a lot of times that the haunting impressions can be from a couple hundred years ago, so even before the house was built. So you don't know that who even lived in that property at all. So it's something we have to kind of research very carefully, and there are some issues around the Earth's the geomagnetic lay of the land, you might say, that still need to be mapped out on a really local level, and you can only do that pretty much with a geomagnetometer, which, unlike the tri-field meters and other EMF detectors, those are a little more expensive. Those run around $600 or more, and you have to be able to learn how to use them properly to really get a good feel for the room that I'm in versus the room next door to see what's actually going on.
Well, if there is truly a recording in this area, and it's got to do with the geomagnetic principles of the location, whether it's the water, the granite, the quartz, the shape of the world, or the tides, or whatever is going on at that point, theoretically, shouldn't we be able to disperse that with a heavy hit from a magnet or something like that would alter or change the parameters of that energy?
Well, I've done that. That's a really good point. And in fact, I still have one. I don't know if you remember the old bulk tape erasers.
Right, yeah.
That you buy from Radio Shack,
sure.
That you use them, they look like an iron.
Uh-huh.
And I've done that in a number of cases. In fact, a lot of times when we have what looks to be a residual haunting, get really small rare earth magnets, the neodymium magnets, which you can buy pretty cheaply on the web, and popping those around on the studs of the baseboard seem to work, because it does seem to shift the magnetic field. Either that or it acts as a placebo on the witnesses. One or the other, it works pretty well to get rid of the experience that people are having.
That's great. I've been wondering about bulking these locations for a long time. I'm glad to know somebody's actually been out there trying that to see if it would disperse.
Yeah, we've been doing that since the 90s. One of my colleagues suggested that as we were kind of figuring out, getting more and more data on the magnetic field stuff. And the first case I tried it with a bulk tape eraser. What was really interesting is the reading on the EMF meter went away after I just basically waved around the bulk tape eraser.
Sure.
It just completely shifted, which when I talk to some electromagnetic physicists about that, they say, well, that shouldn't happen. It's
right,
like,
exactly.
Well, it just did. I don't know what to tell you.
That's great. Well, and they used to make the ones for the TV. Remember when you'd have the TV repairman come? They'd put that big,
that's right. Yeah,
almost like a board game size deal with handles on your TV, and they'd swipe it all over and take away that rainbow effect, and it would like realign or whatever.
I remember those. Yeah,
that would be a great piece to play with as well. We have to take a quick break, and we'll come back. We'll keep talking about the different types of hauntings, how they take place, why they take place, what are the theories and beliefs, and have those theories changed much over the last 100 years? Our guest is Loyd Auerbach.
All right, let me break this. If there's anyone here, you can speak to me now through this device. How many people are here with me right now? Where exactly are you?
All right, we're back here on the Best in Paranormal Talk Radio, Beyond the Darkness, part of your world now, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. You can download our show for free right here. And remember, go download them. Keep up with the shows right now, because once they're about 90 days old, that's when they go into the archives. That's when you'll have to start paying to get the archives. But if you've already downloaded the show, you've got it. So keep up with it on iTunes, or keep up with it here on podcast1.com, and just make sure you subscribe to Beyond the Darkness to never miss another minute. The best of Paranormal Talk Radio. Our guest this evening is Loyd Auerbach. We're discussing the theory of ghosts and what are these different types of hauntings. We were just discussing residual hauntings and some of the possibilities that are going on. And Loyd, one of the aspects I'd like to talk to you about, especially when it comes to our next bit with intelligent hauntings, things that seem to interact with us. One aspect that's always kind of intrigued me when I've been to places like Rolling Hills Asylum or Waverly Hills Sanitarium is the fact that there are cases and instances where the ghosts seem just as blown away by us as we are of them. They take off running in the opposite direction, and you think, God, you're the ghost. What are you afraid of? And I'm left wondering, do hauntings always have to come from our past? if we're all in the same spot throughout time and history, could we be experiencing hauntings from the future? Visitations when the nurse is round the corner at Waverly Hills during its peak and they're seeing ghosts because it's always been haunted according to them. Were we the ones haunting them, the investigators walking through this building in the middle of the night?
Well, that takes on the aspect of what we would call a time slip, which is not really in the realm of being psychic. It's more in the realm of physics in some respects. And there are stories of people who have interacted with folks in the past where the person in the past claims that you are the ghost. You're a ghost from the future kind of thing. So but in those circumstances, there tends to be more physicality of what people are picking up on. The thing about ghosts being afraid of us is the fact that ghosts are people too. They were people when they were alive. There's no reason why they couldn't be afraid of us. Especially if they were people who thought that ghost hunters are trying to get rid of ghosts. They might be running very quickly away.
Sure.
One of my earliest cases, actually, I had to promise the family, because they were having good communications with the apparition, quite a bit, in fact, and I had to promise not to bring any of the stuff that they did in Ghostbusters because this was right around the time the movie came out, and she was afraid we were going to put her in a ghost trap.
Well, understandable, especially if that's how people's perceptions are of how the paranormal works. Boy, wouldn't it be great if it was that simple? We can throw a little trap underneath them and suck the energy in and be able to experiment on that. Has there ever been any actual work in that?
You go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just curious. Has there ever been any historical work on trying to trap a ghost or being able to confine it so that research could be done?
Well, not from a scientific perspective, because we really don't know what we're trying to trap. We don't know what consciousness is made out of. So without knowing what kind of either energy or form of something, matter or whatever it is, there's really not a way to create a trap per se, although I think people probably used electromagnetic fields, tried using Faraday cages and all sorts of things to do that sort of thing, and nothing has ever come of it. But there's an ethical question here. If these were people, and trapping somebody and experimenting on them, to me, is incredibly unethical.
Right.
And inhumane, in fact. Now, if there's the issue of getting rid of them, which doesn't have to be certainly any violence at all, but I have yet to encounter or see, nor have my colleagues, see anything more than bullies when they're alive, bullies when they're dead, rather than true evil people who are hanging around. But we can torture them psychologically with bad jokes and bad music, but the idea of kind of catching one, unless they're really destructive and we have to remove them for some other reason, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, bandying back to the idea of the residual haunting for a moment, so many people talk about the residual haunting, but in real cases, Loyd, how many of you really come in contact with where, every year on the anniversary of the old man's death, you'll see him walking up the spiral staircase and then falling down? Does that actually occur? I've investigated a lot, and I've never seen a residual happen when it's supposed to.
Usually there's a pattern, but the pattern is not typically an anniversary of a death. Or the anniversary of something. It seems to be its own pattern that relates more to the environment than it does actually to any calendar that we set up. Although the time of day seems to be very patterned because that's when the recording was done. Therefore, that's when it plays back. But not a specific day of the year in that. Although there are a couple on record that are like that. It also could be that people are only looking for the ghost, so to speak, the haunting, on the anniversary of that person's death.
Right. Well, I'm talking about the ones that seem to be reported that this is when they're seen the most. And I've gone there repeatedly, and I've never been able to witness anything. Neither have the people I've been with when it comes to those type of investigations. So I've been curious. I mean, it sounds like it's the most relatable and most examinable type of investigation, but it seems to me, and everybody I've spoken to, that it's really kind of the most elusive.
Well, you have to you really have to understand the pattern, and that means you have to talk to a lot of witnesses going back perhaps a number of years, if it's been going on for quite some time. And it may be that you don't experience it at all, but other people do. You may also just pick up some change in energy, the electromagnetic fields. the actual experience, I've certainly had cases where we've taken sensitive psychics or other people who have had experiences to places, and they've picked up on the residual haunting without any problem based on the pattern. But it wasn't a specific day. We didn't have to go a certain day. And, if the folks said it happens every Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon, of course we're going to try Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon, but we also might try on Wednesday at 4 in the afternoon to try other times around that period to see if there's something. And we'd also look for other things, such as on the day that you folks have been experiencing this, let's look at the geomagnetic data that is available from the USGS. Let's find out about things like, lunar cycles and weather conditions, because weather conditions do affect the geomagnetics of things, and they can affect perceptions of things, as do other things. Was there an earthquake at some point nearby? There are a lot of factors we have to kind of look at environmentally, because it does seem to be environmental. The other side of this is that there's a potential experiment that one can do. Mm-hmm. We haven't had the funding for it. These days it wouldn't cost much more than travel expenses, but Michael Persinger at Laurentian University up in Canada, who is kind of the leader on the whole geomagnetic paranormal connection, developed a helmet which has been alternately called the God helmet and the Shakti helmet. That's the consumer version. And it can affect your brain with minor electromagnetics that mimic the Earth's magnetic field shifts, so that people will have mystical or apparent psychic experiences. They actually are hallucinatory. And the question then is, if you did that, put a helmet on a person at a place like Gettysburg, would that charging their brain cause them to perceive that haunting, that residual haunting that's there? And that kind of experiment hasn't been done, but I suspect, several of us suspect, that that brain-environment connection can be kind of juiced a little bit.
Well, and I've always been curious to find out, maybe you know more about this. Does he have more than one helmet? Because how can we judge that, Dave's sitting there with no helmet on, Loyd's got one on, Loyd can see the demon crawling from the corner. If Dave is wearing a helmet as well, keyed into the same parameters, are they both witnessing the same thing? Does that happen with his experiments?
They've never really done that because in the laboratory, but at least to my knowledge, I don't think they've done that. But you can buy, the Shakti helmets are down to about, I think, $300. So technically you could bring 5 of them with a little bit of funding. And, the thing to do in an experiment, though, you would take somebody to 2 different fields. One was a battlefield, the other one wasn't, and see what people perceive, because there's also the element of suggestion that could have a big impact here.
Sure, and our imagination is amazing, and we do have that opportunity, totally. to not be able to differentiate between a real and a vividly imaginative experience, especially, I'm guessing, if you're juicing them with a Shakti helmet. Right. You're giving that brain even more to try to work off of. But I've just been fascinated by what's the idea when you're side by side wearing these helmets and there's something occurring? Are we both witnessing the same thing, or are we, again, because Loyd Auerbach is tuned in differently than Dave Schrader? Will I see different things than you will because of that?
Yeah, there's a good chance that we would pick up something slightly different, or pick up in different ways. You might pick it up visually, and I might hear stuff that relates directly to the imprint.
All right. Now, talking about intelligent hauntings, how rare is a true intelligent interactive haunting?
Well, again, we call those apparition cases, and in parapsychology, because we're not, first of all, because the apparition doesn't seem to necessarily have to stay in one place. They tend to, just like people do. They're kind of haunting the place, you might say, just like Norman Cliff haunted Cheers.
Right.
So many years ago. But when we talk about these conscious apparitions, the conscious beings, entities, they're fairly rare, but especially compared to hauntings. I mean, residual hauntings are all over the place because the environment's recording stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. The people sticking around, relative to the number of people who die and relative to the reports of ghostly encounters, which I'd say 95 to 98% of which are at the moment of death of that person or within a few days, and it's people seeing their friends and loved ones who have just passed away. They go away. They don't come back again unless you get a medium to bring them back. So you have a very small number of potential deceased people who stick around as apparitions, and that they're not common, but they do happen. There certainly are enough cases that are on the record, even going on today. And we have places like the USS Hornet where we have multiples, a couple dozen guys who are hanging out there, at least, based on the witness reports.
That I will tell you, one of the strangest experiences I've ever had was being on board the Hornet during an investigation when one of the pieces of equipment they had began beeping as though it was Morse code. And the machine was not built to do what it was doing, but we recorded it. They actually reached out to someone that was proficient in Morse code. It had to be slowed down because it was coming through extremely fast, but they started giving information from that. And it was funny because it was like a ship-to-shore call that was being made so he could hear the Morse code, and he started to give it back. The docent from the Hornet said that in the research they're doing, it was giving parameters and like a location, but it was using code that would have been used during World War II.
That makes perfect sense. But that's what these guys were used to.
Right. Yeah. And isn't that fascinating, though, that you're picking up on something like that? But that, again, that's a magnetic message, right? It was a beep, 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 beep. You're sending this telegraph, this message. That would seem like it would be perfect. But then you start looking at like the Twilight Zone idea, right? If you can start to hear this, can we broadcast back? And how bad can we mess up the timeline if we end up intercepting or playing with their field?
Well, there's two assumptions here. To say we're sending it back is that the device, through whatever means, picking up on an actual ship-to-shore transmission, or was there one of the guys on the Hornet, one of the entities on the Hornet, was he affecting the device to provide an example of something? And if it's either one of those, there's nothing to send back. I mean, you could send it back to him, but he's probably already listening in your conversations. The only other possibility is it's coming through time, in which case that's a good question as to whether or not you could send something back. And, none of that's been done yet as far as we know.
Right.
Of course, if there's been any changes to the timeline, we wouldn't know anyway.
Or we would. Mandela effect. There seems to be strange things taking place around us all the time, that false memories are taking place in massive forms. But again, I wonder if that's part of the 100 monkey program, right? I mean, if 100 people start believing something some way, does a collective consciousness start to shape, and people that are tuned in that way will start to have that same kind of memory, creating this weird Mandela effect?
Yeah, possibly.
All right. The apparition hauntings, so many people claim that there's something going on in their home, and it gets to the point where, even as a host, I roll my eyes at some of these. I'm like, there's just no way there could be this much activity taking place all around us. Are you seeing any kind of cosmic change where there is more paranormal activity happening now more than has ever been in the past?
No, but, there's two things here. Number one, we have all these paranormal TV shows that have been playing for over 10 years now, and people watching them, people hearing about them, especially the ones that scare them, they will be more sensitized to things that they perhaps wouldn't have noticed or wouldn't have ever thought of. So some house settling noises, sounds of squirrels in the attic. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can cause you, based on what you believe you're hearing or seeing, can cause you to believe that it's something paranormal. And that's partly because of the suggestion of a lot of these shows. On the other side of this, because of these shows, more people are perhaps willing to talk about their experiences. And over the years, myself, my colleagues, we talk to people. I've talked to people at parties. I talked to people when I used to carpool, just kind of like casual commuting, carpooling, just getting in somebody's car, coming from where I live in the East Bay to San Francisco, and having conversations with people. Once they find out who I am, they tell me a story that they've never told anybody else because it wasn't appropriate given our society saying that that's weird or strange. So I haven't seen an increase, and I don't think any of us have seen an increase in experiences. We have seen somewhat of an increase in people reporting their experiences because they feel a little more comfortable doing that.
Out of all the calls you get to investigate, when you go out of 100 phone calls that you deem as worthy of at least taking a look at, how many of those truly turn into something you would believe to be paranormal in nature and not just imagined or over exaggerated?
Well, of course, there's a bit of a vetting process on the phone, and a lot of times what even may have been a real paranormal experience is not worthy of investigation because it happened to somebody 3 months ago and they just happened to hear your podcast, and of course now they know who to call. So it hasn't happened since then. It was only a 1 or 2 time experience, and until it happens again, we don't know that it's still going on and it's not worthy investigating. It's kind of a cold case at that point. So if we got down to 100 cases that might potentially have something, first thing I would say is that probably 99 out of 100 have something non-paranormal happening as part of what's going on. Even if every single one of them had a ghost or a haunting happening, there's still some elements of what they're experiencing that are going to not be paranormal, because people get overly sensitized once they have a real paranormal experience. So we have to actually look, when we go in, we have to look at not just the overall case, is it paranormal, but what are the events that they're reporting, the experiences they're reporting, how many of those could have been really or are paranormal. And I'd say, like I said, 99 of 100 have some element of that. Of the ones we've gone in, usually it tends to be something like, I haven't really quantified this, but I'm going to say that it's probably about 75%, because we've done the vetting up front, have some psychic experience of some sort, but it may not fit under the apparition or haunting or poltergeist category. It may be some other form of psychic experience that's there.
You take a paper clip and you stroke a magnet across it a few times, and then take your paper clip and apply it to another paper clip, and suddenly it's magnetized.
Right.
Do you believe that people that are exposed to prolonged exposure to haunted locations, whether it's residual or apparition, do you believe that they become somewhat magnetized, so that when they're going to other locations, it's not like the ghost is following them, but now they're becoming acutely aware to other spirits and other energies because they've been kind of basked in that magnetic glow from wherever they're at?
It's not just the magnetic glow, it's just the fact that they've had the experience at all. And it hasn't made them afraid for it, or they've gotten used to it. One of the things we know about psychic experience in general is that the more you know, if you start noticing that you've had one or are having one, you'll start noticing that you're having more. Psychic development, developing your ESP and even psychokinesis to some extent, involves being aware that you're already a bit psychic, and then when you have these experiences, just getting used to them opens you up even further. So it's not unusual. In fact, I've taken people from one apparition or haunting case, if they're not afraid and they're interested, we have another case in the general area, and I'll call them and say, hey, you want to come and see if you pick anything up at these locations? And it's been very successful to do that. I wouldn't, certainly not bringing them in as psychics, but bringing them in because they had a ghost experience, can they see the next ghost, is always an interesting thing both for me and for them. And it's also great for the people, for the household we're going into, because these people, the clients, the new clients, actually meet someone who had gone through the exact same thing, which helps them from a psychological perspective.
How often do you get called into an investigation, Lloyd, where the person is standing next to you telling you the apparition is right there, but you're unable to see it, your medium is unable to see it, but they are very acutely aware of what it is and what it's doing? Pretty
rare for us to have an investigation or a situation where, first of all, I'm not going to see it. Likelihood is I might feel something, but I'm sure as hell not going to see it because I haven't seen any ghosts, seen things move, but not ghosts. The psychics or mediums that I work with are really good. I've been vetting them for quite some time, and the odds are if the person is seeing something, then the medium's picking something up or the psychic's picking something up, except in those circumstances where, of course, it turns out that there's actually nothing paranormal happening and it's all in the imagination or psychology of that witness, in which case good psychics will pick that up and be able to kind of cut through that piece of things really fast for us.
Well, I know our friend Dr. Barry Taff has had a lot of work and research and belief in the fact that he thinks that a lot of people that have really profound paranormal experiences and sightings usually are dealing with some form of epilepsy or kinetic brain activity. Have you found any proof of that in your research and what you do?
Well, that's specifically for poltergeist cases in general. And of course, Barry does not lean at all towards the survival aspect of things. But in poltergeist cases, which are coming from living people, and it involves physical things and often can involve also apparitional sightings to some small extent, or can be involved in the residual haunting cases. We have, in the studies that have been done within parapsychology, 30% of the poltergeist agents have had some sort of neurological element, whether it's epilepsy or epileptiform activity in their brain. So it's been about 30% as best we can see. Now, one of the interesting things that has been pretty clear for a lot of us in and around the field is that we often attract the kinds of cases that fit what we're interested in. And Barry's very interested in the neurological, brain-centric kinds of cases, and it seems that those are the ones he tends to attract. One of my colleagues in England, who was a 50-year veteran, he passed away a few years ago, Tony Cornell, talked about getting 95% of his cases were all residual haunting, because he was not really into apparition or poltergeist cases so much, although he did have some poltergeist cases as well. So it's almost as if we almost attract these things. I'm kind of broad-based, so I get all sorts of things as it happens. I'm fascinated by it all. But definitely one of the things we consider is the neurological element, and that does play in sometimes with pure apparition cases, or especially when there's only a single witness.
We know that there's medications in a lot of cases that can help with epilepsy, especially now that you're getting the advent of cannabinoid oil and other things. Has there been any research or look into the fact of people that were having paranormal experiences, if they medicate, the experiences stop, whether it's full-on physical poltergeist activity of things moving and major activity as opposed to just your keys go missing from time to time? Has there been any kind of proof that changing the brain chemistry does change the physical parameters of a haunting or a poltergeist?
There hasn't really been any research in that area. We do know, of course, that some people who are schizophrenic are actually not. They may be psychically open, and, of course, the medication does shut them down as well. So that certainly is an indicator of what you're talking about. There are cases on record of people with epilepsy who had poltergeist activities, the physical activity, and in some instances, a few instances on record, the individual was off their medication but didn't have any seizures during the entire run of the poltergeist activity, as if the activity itself was the seizure. So there's a lot more to what's going on here than just the brain chemistry.
Well, we've talked now about the different forms of haunting. We're tickling around the poltergeist phenomena. What can you tell me about poltergeist and what it is and what it is not? I mean, Hollywood has certainly twisted it on its ear and given people a false perception of it. But what can you tell us are the realities and the falsities that we've been led to believe?
Well, the term was originally applied in, as far back as we know so far, 16th century Germany was, one of my colleagues found, one of the first uses of the term. And it was applied to specific kinds of situations, what we call, ghost situations or hauntings, where physical things would happen. And early on, it was mainly bangs and raps on the walls, and then things would start moving around, furniture and all sorts of things. This is in the historical record. So that term in Germany was coined to respond to noisy or nuisance spirits, because at the time, that's all they could come up with. I mean, there was nothing ever seen, no ghosts were ever seen, no voices were ever heard typically. You just had this physical stuff going on, but it was invisible, so people thought it was ghosts at some level. And over the last several hundred years, researchers have looked at these cases. And in the early 20th century, a researcher named Nandor Fodor, who was a leading researcher in parapsychology field investigation, but also a psychoanalyst. He was many other things, too. He was a lawyer and a music guy and all sorts of things. But he looked at certain poltergeist cases, again, typically not having apparition sightings or any other indicator of a ghost. He looked at those as centered around a living person and kind of started the model that William Roll came to in the 1950s, in 58, with a case in Seaford, Long Island. He formed the model that it was the unconscious mind of a living agent, in that case it was a young boy, who was dealing with stress and tension, and that was pretty clear in the case. And the events, the physical events, were all responding to what was going on in his unconscious. When they worked with him, things stopped. So the poltergeist, typically it's used in the U.S. as referring to situations in which there is physical activity, which means anybody who's looking can see it, because it's not psychic, it's physical. But the source of that activity is one person's unconscious, whether it is because of neurological issues or stress or tension. There can be either of those. In the UK, they still use the term poltergeist to refer to any situation in which there is physical object movement or activity, and then they break it out into living agent poltergeists and apparitional poltergeists, so ghostly poltergeists. We tend to just call it apparitional PK. It's just a function of the ghost being able to move things for us. It's not the same thing for us when we use that term.
How much energy, and shouldn't it be measurable by equipment? If they're able to move things, slam doors, move chairs, throw glasses, shouldn't there be some kind of reading that we can get from the environment that would have changed for something that powerful and that dramatic?
Well, this speaks to psychokinesis in general, to mind over matter in general. And in all the research of psychokinesis, there has been no pattern of energetic anything. Roll and others have done studies figuring out how much energy would be required to move an object off a shelf. You can kind of calculate that from a physics perspective, but there's nothing that you can point to as the source of energy, except that in some circumstances, electrostatic fields have been detected. That was something that is possibly happening sometimes. But the thing about psychokinesis, which is really odd, is it's very much a trickster phenomena. We've had situations working with people who can do PK where one moment we are detecting electrostatic field coming off the individual, and the next moment we're not, and the object is still moving. So it's almost as if it rotates through a number of different possible ways it could move things, and that's coming from our unconscious, and we're still not really sure about that. But I will say that the human body can generate a huge electrostatic field, enough to move maybe not a couch, but a lot of other objects. And so it's possible that at least that's responsible for some of it. We just have a lot of other ideas about what might be going on in psychokinesis, and this is still an area with conscious psychokinesis we need to do research with.
Does poltergeist activity seem to happen around heightened emotional situations mostly? A lot of hauntings I've been asked to come in and look at, I'll start talking to the family and I see, drug addiction, alcoholism, definite dysfunction. And it seems the more of that type of activity I see, the more violent in nature, and I don't necessarily mean like, killing, but I mean the more things are moved about. Yeah, chaotic, right. The environment is. Do you believe that there's something to be said with that, or do you find happy-go-lucky families that are dealing with that same kind of situation?
Well, there have been both. I mean, the happy-go-lucky family is dealing with the poltergeist situation. It means that the poltergeist agent has some other point of stress beyond their family, that maybe they're having somebody who's having real problems at work or at school, and that's the stress that's actually coming out at that point. Or everybody's putting on a false face. They're not really happy. They're all really stressed out. They hate each other, and they're just pretending to be nice, in which case that kind of stress and tension can really blow up. But on the other side, the family dynamic can cause a huge amount of stress on one person. One thing that's interesting about poltergeist agents is they tend to be the kind of person who has no other outlet. So it wouldn't be the teenager that's yelling back at their parents. It would be the teenager who's sitting quietly and just taking it all. So it would be, in other circumstances, this might be the kid who went to school and brought a gun and shot a bunch of people, and people would then say, he was so quiet.
So it's the Carrie White syndrome from Stephen
exactly.
King book, right? It's that kind of introverted person that might be just the most chaotic inside. Right.
They're chaotic inside. Think about it. An epileptic seizure is a brainstorm.
Right.
That's chaos.
When a poltergeist activity kind of happens, this chaotic information or activity that's going on, are they short-lived? Can they last long periods of time? I've heard from different quote-unquote experts that some it's they'll last a week to 30 days, but nothing more. Others that say they can last up to years. What is your findings?
Yeah. The typical range is like a week and a half to a year and a half. Mm-hmm. That's the range we see. There are cases there, however, where if the stressor for that poltergeist agent builds up again. So let's say that, for whatever reason, it's happening because it's a 19-year-old who's in college and he's freaking out about his grades, and this happens for a month. Well, 5 years later, it hasn't happened since then. 5 years later, he's in a job where he's just as stressed out, or even more so now because of his position, and it can happen again. So it's not necessarily that it lasts for years consistently, but it certainly can reoccur because the thing that is causing that can reoccur. The thing that's happening internally can reoccur.
One of the other points, and I don't know if it's fact or fiction compared to you, but is it usually found more with women, preteen women? I know that's what we've heard. Women that are just reaching puberty seem to be the biggest conduits for this. Is there any truth to that, or no? It doesn't matter, male, woman.
I think we can thank Stephen King for that.
Right.
Honestly, all the surveys show that it's 60% are adolescents, meaning from about age 11 or 12 to early 20s. Mm-hmm. Of course, the teen years are right in the middle of that, and in most of the surveys, it's been generally a little bit more female than male, but typically following the population statistics in the area. So it's not necessarily. The one thing, though, that's really interesting is that it's, until relatively recently, I think, it's been more likely that teenage boys had physical outlets, whether it was sports or gym or something like that, whereas girls didn't. So one of the things that's interesting is the poltergeist agents, not only being quiet or keeping it bound up inside, they actually have they're not physically active typically. They're not running around, they're not biking, they're not doing exercise, they're certainly not doing martial arts or playing football or anything like that.
So it's a buildup of static electricity that eventually needs an outlet.
It's a buildup of something, yeah. Right. Stress, tension, brain energy, electrochemical energy. There's something going on that needs to let loose.
What about women that are menopausal? Right there, it seems like there's definitely some chemical changes and hormonal changes. Do we see any kind of rise or fall in that activity around women of that age?
There hasn't really been a concerted study of that, but I've had cases of women in that range, and even had a case of a woman who was 80 years old, who, because of some long-standing issues with her husband, were finally coming to a head.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it can go pretty late in life too, especially again if it's neurological. It can be pretty much any time.
I mean, you've seen a lot, Loyd. You've been out on a lot of investigations.
Yeah.
Have you ever gotten into one where you thought, "Oh crap, I'm in over my head on this one"?
Not because of the paranormal, but sometimes because of the living people being crazy.
Right.
Or drunk.
Yes,
that's happened a couple times too.
I agree with that. That the living scare me a lot more than the dead. Malevolent spirits. I mean, again, there's certain things that sell. Scary and malevolent and demonic is sexy on TV. In most of these cases, and I try to tell a lot of the people that are telling me that they're dealing with the demonic or malevolent cases, and I ask, well, what is it? What specifically? Well, they tugged my hair. Okay. To me, malevolent is they're going to drag you to the ground.
You're right. Wasn't it? I think it was last year or the year before. There was a video going around of some folks, some ghost hunting team in the Midwest who had gone to an old abandoned. It wasn't an asylum, it was a hospital, and they caught a supposed demon dog on audio, and it was a dog barking in the background, and if you did any research, you found out there were wild dogs in the area.
Right.
But they immediately saw, they heard a growl, therefore it must be a demon.
Where do you stand? Do you believe in demons? Do you believe that is a real faction of the paranormal, or are you one that does not?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not. I don't have the religious background for that. I believe that there can be, certainly since we are dealing with ghosts that were alive, and when they were alive, they could have been nice people or apathetic people, which would be, say, most of them, or they could have been bullies. And I think there still are bullies around who try to freak people out or do things. But I think in general, it's more about somebody trying to get our attention than anything negative per se. But we perceive things negatively. Even the ghost hunting groups that talk about getting the EVP of get out in that way. When you really look into how they were behaving, most of the time I find out that they were trying to provoke something. And hey, if I was the ghost in that house, I wouldn't be just yelling "get out." I'd be whacking them upside the head, and of course immediately be labeled as a demon, even though they were the ones that were acting rude.
Right. And I get a lot of the calls like that where people feel that they're dealing with the demonic, and again, I ask them, well, what are some of the clues? Well, they knocked 3 times. And I've heard from people that I really like and respect that are in the field and bill themselves as demonologists or that deal with the more vigorous hauntings, and they'll automatically assume that because it's in 3s, it's mocking the Holy Trinity. Therefore, it's doing this, it's doing that. And then I always tell my people when they call me up about this, I go, do me a favor and close your eyes. Imagine you're walking up to your friend's front door. It says, doorbell isn't working, please knock. Now imagine you knocking. What does it sound like?
Right.
And in most cases, it's 3 raps, or you give it the old shaving a haircut, doon, 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 doon. Those are the kind of knocks that most people do nowadays. That 3, it's psychology, right? Isn't it? That's why we see signs that say live, live.
3 is that number. And, and if it was the ghost of Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, it would not only be 3 knocks, it would be 3 knocks 3 times.
That's right. And you're getting that. So I tell people, a lot of times, you take yourself out of the perspective of believing in the demons. Not that there isn't something dark out there. I believe there's a dark force. You want to call it the jinn or demons or demonic energy. I think there's something dark out there. I've just been in some weird places, man. You just pick up on it. And whether it is just a severely pissed off ghost or not, there's something, different on those cases than on others. But I tell most people, when you start off your conversation with, I think I have a demon, I usually stop people. If you think you have a demon, you do not have a demon. A demon's not going to give you 3 little scratches across your cheek. If it's a true demon, it's going to vivisect you. It's going to.
Well, I think there's a couple things here. First of all, saying something might be harmful to you is not the same as saying that it's evil.
Right.
A great white shark is not evil, but you might consider it the demon of the sea.
Yeah.
Because it's it's not necessarily malevolent. It's just that's what it is. And the other thing is, so much of the overlay comes from various religious interpretations that have shifted in the last 2,000 years quite a bit. I'm a big fan of the TV show Lucifer, which has a wonderful interpretation of Lucifer, morning star, and the Bible and all that, and heaven and hell, and it's really interesting because they're going off of some of the early actual mythology, which is also what the movie Dogma did, Kevin Smith's movie, looking at the mythology from the early days of what demons and angels actually are. And technically, they're supposed to be tempters, not attacking us. That's something that came out of the Middle Ages, from Dante, in fact, a lot of it.
Well, and it's good for business, right? If there's demons, you're going to come back to the church to seek help and counsel and get the help. And again, I'm not trying to slam on any type of religion, but it does seem that, I find it fascinating that they are training more and more exorcists right now. And they're having courses at the Vatican, and people are going away from the church in droves. Well, isn't it a good idea to, maybe scare up a little business again? If you start talking about this and people start fearing, maybe it's going to drive them back into the churches seeking help.
Well, and yet the largest Catholic country in the world is Brazil. And in Brazil, all Catholics and everybody else believes in Spiritism. Many people who are good Catholics channel spirits. They are mediums. And the Catholic Church leaves them alone about that. And the reason why the Catholic Church leaves them alone about that is because that they started going after the Spiritists in Brazil, which is a large portion of the Catholic population. They would drive all those people away from the church. So it's actually, in some respects, like just a convenience.
What is your take on phenomena like electronic voice phenomena? Do you believe that we are truly recording disembodied voices, or do you think that there's a better chance that we're imprinting ourselves onto these recorders and audio devices?
Well, there may be. I tend to favor the latter, but I actually think that there may be an in-between here, because it is entirely possible that some people may be, without realizing it, may be mediums of a sort. Mm-hmm. It may be that they are unconsciously communicating with somebody, but they're also interacting with the device to cause that voice to appear. The problem with a lot of EVP, as you know, is that it doesn't necessarily give real information. It just seems to give the answer to some questions. And, of course, a lot of it's just gobbledygook. And there are EVPs of those residual hauntings also that come through with some people who do EVP. So it may be about the person that's doing it, but they may actually be picking up some real information from time to time as well. It's just something that really needs to be studied very carefully. And at this point, it really hasn't been.
Have there been major leaps and bounds in the last 150 years in trying to understand ghosts and the paranormal, or do you believe we're? I read a lot of the books from back then that you can find online now on Amazon and places like that, where you can see they've republished those old books, and a lot of the theory and beliefs don't seem to have really altered much in all this time.
No, I mean, some of the basic ideas of why one person sees a ghost and the other one hears the ghost is related to the fact that we're picking up the broadcast signal from that ghost differently. Your brain is processing the information different than my brain, but it's the same signal. So it's two different kinds of TV sets. And that hasn't changed because that seems to be what the model actually is. The thing that we don't know is, that we still don't know in general in science, is what consciousness is, whether it's in the body while we're alive or after death. And that's a big question and a big debate in science, and we haven't gotten any further so much with that. And I think that's really the key to us understanding what a ghost might be, is really understanding what consciousness actually is in the body, and then how much of it can actually either leave the body or be outside the body in general while we're alive, not just while we're dead. But there have been kind of leaps and bounds in terms of the kinds of research that have been done with mediums, for example. For the last several years, there's been some excessively good research done by the Windbridge Institute in Tucson with psychic mediums, and also the Institute of Noetic Sciences has done work with them. There's been brain scan research done with mediums that definitely shows different patterns while they're communicating with spirits ostensibly versus just having a conversation with us living folks. There's something definitely going on there, and the more we can work with people who like that, the better handle we'll get, at least on the communication process, maybe not perhaps the ghosts themselves.
If people are interested, Loyd, in really trying to understand and not just go off of what they see on TV to become an investigator, you've got courses, you've got things that people can get involved in. I want people to know how to do that so that they can start to educate themselves properly. Mm-hmm. You know, just because I watched Starsky and Hutch growing up and NYPD Blue doesn't make me a cop. Just like watching
Right.
Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Paranormal State, and Most Haunted does not make you a paranormal investigator. What do you offer, and how can people get involved in that if they really want to take this seriously and investigate?
Well, as it happens, on the third week of February, we're starting an online class on field investigations through the Rhine Research Center. It's rhine.org, and you'll see a link for education on the left-hand side of the screen when it comes up. And there is like I said, an 8 weeks field investigation class that's being offered there, which people can take for fun, or they can take it for a grade. If they take it for the grade and they pass, which most people tend to do, they end up in my network of investigators, and also entry into or connected to other researchers as well. And if you don't want to do a pattern online class, I have, through the school you mentioned before, HCH Institute, I offer these distance learning classes, which are mainly audio-based. So think of it as lengthy podcasts with text materials and some video and supporting things. And there's definitely one on investigations and on related areas. But one of the things that I would strongly suggest people do is think outside the box for ghost hunting. The fact is that investigating is part of what we do in parapsychology. And ESP, psychokinesis, PK, those are involved in all ghostly experiences and encounters. And you need to know a little bit about that stuff too. So just looking at what happens from the TV shows and working off that is not going to give you the full spectrum of understanding of what might be going on, and would not give you the opportunity to come up with new ways of looking at this, which is what we're always looking for. We do want people who are new in parapsychology to start looking at these things, but you can't do it based off on sitting around in the dark in the middle of the night in an old place, since that's not how an investigation is actually even done.
We've got, in our palm of our hands, we've got some of the most powerful computers in the world now that are sensitive to everything from barometric pressure to dew point and everything in between. Do you believe that we're getting closer with technology of starting to measure and be able to predict or prove aspects of the paranormal now more than we've ever been? Or do you think that electronics and devices are never going to really get to the point we need them to be to give us definitive proof and answers?
Well, what we're certainly getting better at, and if there was more funding in the field, or if people were able to kind of put resources together appropriately, is the ability to see what the environment does when somebody has a ghostly experience versus when they don't. I mean, if you could rig up a situation where we have all these sensors in a place where people are occasionally reporting a residual haunting or an apparitional experience, and gather data both when they're not having the experience and when they are, and looking at the comparison for those two, we might actually be able to model what's actually happening there. That, think of it as kind of like there's a nice fog and there's an invisible man walking through, and you can't see the invisible man or detect that person, but you can certainly see the shape of that person walking through the fog. So we're trying to figure out what that person is, what that ghost is, what energy is. And we have no way to figure that out unless we know all the other things that, A, can affect people's perceptions, and then, B, what the patterns are that connect to those experiences. So that's something that we could get to right now, which should be done, which really hasn't been done enough. As far as, I don't know about proving things, we haven't proved that we're conscious. Proof is a very difficult term in science, and I know people always ask me, can you prove the existence of ghosts? And my response is, right out of Star Trek, prove to me that you have a mind, that I have a mind. It's all experiential. It's all subjective. It's all anecdotal, if you want to call it that. So we have to have a better understanding of what consciousness is. And once we understand what consciousness is, I think we can get there pretty quickly. We just have to have a couple of volunteer ghosts come into the laboratory for us.
Well, you've listened to us right here. If you're a spirit out there looking to prove that you exist, you can reach out to us at dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll pass the email on to Loyd Auerbach, and we can start those tests. I'd love for that opportunity to come where we're able to start to actually look at this, but do you think science is ever going to take an actual hard-nosed look at investigating these things, or is it always going to be fringe science that will keep an open mind?
Mainstream science in the United States especially has such a materialist, reductionist perspective that, and thanks to the skeptics organizations, it's very difficult for even the scientists who are interested in this to express their personal interest in an academic setting. It's become a really difficult climate. Many of us have talked to top researchers in all fields who have personally expressed their interest, but if they admitted it to their colleagues or to their department, they could actually lose their jobs. And until that prejudice, that bias changes, I don't know what's going to happen. There's not a whole lot that can happen here in the States. The thing that gets me the most about that kind of attitude is that people have these experiences, and they are not looking at what these experiences actually are. I don't care if they approach it from the perspective of, okay, it's not a ghost, so let's figure out what it is, but they're not even doing that. And a lot of times the explanations they come up with, some of them are laughable when it comes right down to it. 5 people have an experience at the same time. I hear from the skeptic, it's mass hallucination. And yet, I turn around and ask them, where's the data that supports that there's such a thing as mass hallucination? That's actually harder to find than ghost experiences.
Right, and that would be something in itself, transcendence, right? That we can collectively join a consciousness to all see and witness and experience the exact same thing at the same time.
Yeah, I keep putting it to these people. It's like, what if there's something purely psychological here that is something nobody's ever looked at? Unless you guys who don't believe in ghosts start researching it, looking for something like that, nobody's ever going to find it, except maybe us, by accident.
Yeah, and isn't it ridiculous when you look at all of the amazing scientific, findings out there? Even here's one that's so interesting to me. What was it? 25 years ago, a guy said, "Listen, I think ulcers are a bacterial infection." And he got laughed out of symposiums. He was looked at as just a jackass who had no clue what he was talking about. They literally laughed him out of symposiums. And lo and behold, testings come back. What do they find? They find that ulcers are not just our stomach eating themselves away and these magical holes that appear because of stress, but it turns out that they are, in fact, bacterial infections and can be treated with different forms of antibiotics. But it seems every science has got in their mind that this can't be possible and refuse to give, to yield to those positions. And we lose so much valuable time. Whereas it seems the big question in the world is what comes next? What happens to us? And, why that wouldn't be more important to mainstream science to at least look at and give it a real college try and then say, you know what? Okay, we've run as many experiments as we legitimately can, and we can't find an answer. Because I think once you crack that code, and like you said, once you get to the understanding of what is consciousness, that can start changing and shifting the whole paradigm on how we handle health, mental health, physical well-being, and how we communicate with one another. And that's, I think, the next evolution for us.
Yeah, I agree. It's the kind of the final frontier in some respects, is to understand what consciousness actually is. And there are a lot of people researching that question. Of course, they're coming at it from different perspectives. Mm-hmm. It's just still not an accepted course of study in most parts of the country, unless you come at it from a purely brain-centric perspective.
What website can people find more information about you and your work, Loyd?
Well, at the moment, my website, our server blew up,
okay.
So my website's down.
All right.
It'll be back up within the month. It's within a month. It's called It's mindreader.com. If they want to find out about the Rhine courses, it's rhine.org. I am on Facebook. I have a Loyd Auerbach author page. That's an easy place for people to find out what I'm doing. They can follow me on Twitter, which is probably the easiest thing, and that's at Prof Paranormal, P-R-O-F, Paranormal. So those are probably the easiest ways to connect with me. My email is profparanormal@gmail.com, and I'm happy to respond as best I can to folks' requests or emails. And I should mention that my first book, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists, which was kind of set me on this track, came out 30 years ago, and I put out a 30th anniversary reprint of it in October, so it's available on Amazon. And there's also a new one coming out called Psychic Dreaming, which will be out in April.
Well, great. When that new book comes out, will you come back with us and talk about it?
Absolutely.
We'd love to have you back, and we'll put up links so you can find Loyd's books and ways to communicate with him. That's it for this evening. Special thanks to our guest, Loyd Auerbach, for the evening. To Tim Dennis, myself, Dave Schrader, you've been listening to the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. We'll be back again tomorrow with more Beyond the Darkness.